Today's video is another compilation of some of the worst cave diving tragedies we have covered on this channel, from an instructor being accused of murder to exploring off-limits caves to one of England's greatest underwater caves, and finally the end of a 30-year search. We cover it all. I appreciate everyone who watches my marathon videos, but if you want to see the news stories as they get posted, just hit the subscribe button as I post once a week. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. On Sunday, July 24, 2016, dive instructor Nigel Craig began a deep specialty course dive for a student, Richard Stansfield. Tragically, it would be Richard's final dive. They were entering the depths of a disused flooded quarry in Leicestershire, UK, a popular dive training site. But the events that would follow would be the beginning of a hellish chapter in Nigel's life, as he was prosecuted for his student's death. This case led to medical discoveries that would change dive training forever. This is their story. Stony Cove has a long history of being a popular dive training site, stemming from beginners to deep specialty dives, and for good reason. The massive flooded quarry is easy to access and has several shelves of different depths ranging from 7 meters to 35 meters at its deepest point. Its location, history, and depth make it the perfect training location. This is a place that Nigel Craig was intimately familiar with. Nigel himself had learned how to dive in Stony Cove in 1996, and after 20 years, he was now an instructor there. Over the years, he had completed hundreds of dives as both a diver and instructor for his local dive center, Dive Northampton. Nigel was a true veteran of the quarry and knew every inch of its terrain. So when Richard Stansfield, a 40-year-old advanced open water certified diver, approached Nigel to become a certified deep diver, things were quickly put into motion. To earn his certification, Richard would have to complete 3 separate dives with an instructor. The first was already completed during his open water certification, and his second dive would be scheduled for Sunday, July 24, 2016, at Stony Cove. The course's purpose is to better help divers understand the effects of pressure at depth, how increased air consumption and nitrogen loading necessitate shorter dive times, how narcosis can affect diver judgment, and the importance of making safety stops to mitigate the potential for decompression sickness. For those of you that have watched my previous diving or cave diving videos, all of these topics are reoccurring factors in things going wrong under the water. When arriving at Stony Cove, you pull your car up to a small parking lot, unload your gear, and walk down a small staircase right next to the bank of the water, before walking another 100 yards or so to the first entrance into the water. It is a small staircase surrounded by an old metal guardrail, with 2 or 3 steps above water before disappearing into the depths. The plan on July 24th was to follow this exact route, where Nigel Craig, his dive partner Carol Tokarczyk, and Richard Stansfield would enter the water while putting on their gear. They would then have a short briefing and safety check before making a 100-meter swim to a descent line, marking an area in the cove that led to the hyperbox at a depth of 35 meters. The metal structure used for commercial dive training, and recreational instructors used it for deep dives. After reaching the depth, they would then ascend back to 5 meters, where they would make a mandatory 3-minute safety stop before surfacing. Now, this is important, as it will later come back in the story. After going over the plan one final time, the trio would begin their surface swim out to the dive line, and after reaching the correct area, they would wait a few minutes on the surface for Richard to catch his breath. Once he was ready, the trio would put their regulators into their mouths and begin the descent. It took approximately 10 minutes to reach the dive's maximum depth of 32 meters. Normally, this is a faster process, but during the descent, Richard had trouble with his buoyancy. After reaching the bottom of the quarry, Nigel would complete an air check. This is where he noticed that Richard had 150 bars remaining in his 12-liter cylinder. For perspective, Richard had started the dive with 250. Now, this wasn't a crisis moment, mainly because Richard and his partner Carol each had an extra 12-liter canister of air, but it certainly perked Nigel's eyebrows. He made a mental note to double-check Richard's air supplies in a few minutes, but first they were going to complete a navigation exercise. During this exercise, Richard was struggling with his buoyancy. His body was slowly floating towards the surface, and he continuously had to adjust to keep himself submerged with the other two divers. Nigel cut the exercise short to repeat the test, and during the second attempt, Richard would pass with flying colors. This is when Nigel would check Richard's air supply for a second time, and he would receive a signal for 60 bars. This was much less than Nigel expected based on his earlier check, so he immediately signaled for the dive to end and begin the ascent. On the way up, he would signal for Carol to continue to check Richard's air supply, and at 18 meters, Richard would indicate that he was out of air, even though Carol saw that there were 20 bars left in his tank. Nigel would later state, "There was no indication of any heavy breathing, no sign of panic, nothing like that. So I decided to swap him onto Carol's alternate." After getting reassurance from Richard, now that he was breathing from Carol's alternate tank, the group would continue to ascend, but once again, Richard would soon signal that he was out of air. At this point, Nigel was confused. Carol had purged the regulator and everything was working fine, yet Richard could not breathe. Carol would make the decision to put him on his own tank. They locked eyes, and Carol gave the calm down signal. Richard would give the okay, and they would carry on. As they approached the final 5 meters, Nigel thought that it was still prudent to make the 3-minute safety stop, as Richard was calm and there was still plenty of air. 2 minutes into the safety stop, issues would begin again. Richard, out of nowhere, would panic and try to bolt for the surface, but Nigel would quickly reach out and grab him, trying to prevent him from making an unsafe ascent. In the confusion, Richard's regulator would be pulled from his mouth. Nigel would later state that he didn't understand why Richard was saying he's got no air when he does. Everything was working just fine, yet Richard couldn't breathe. Nigel would look up at Richard's eyes, and they would glaze over. That's when he noticed the regulator was not in Richard's mouth. He signaled to Carol to ascend, and Nigel, along with Richard, would ascend seconds later, but it was too late. Nigel would immediately shout for help, and after being picked up by a rescue boat, Richard would be resuscitated by paramedics and taken by ambulance to the hospital. 5 hours later, Richard would be pronounced dead. After the accident, Nigel and his wife Della would move on with their lives, at least as best they could. But in September of 2020, 4 long years after the accident, Nigel would receive a letter informing him that he would be prosecuted for gross negligence manslaughter. Nigel would state that he was knocked backwards. He didn't know what was going on. The prosecution would base their case on the idea that Nigel had held his unwilling student underwater and the misguided belief that a safety stop was more important than preventing him drowning. It was conceded during the trial that there were no issues with the planning and execution up until the final 5 meters. Dive computer records submitted as evidence would show that Richard had misreported his air supply by as much as 30 bars during the first air check. And the biggest defense for Nigel was that while expert divers were testifying, they would state, "I have been on both ends of the octopus, and I know of no instructor who would skip a safety stop after a 30-meter dive with an adequate supply of air available." The prosecution would switch gears and argue that Nigel controlled Richard's buoyancy to keep him underwater while he drowned, but this was dismissed due to Carol being by Nigel's side and seen as utterly ridiculous that a dive master would sit back and let that happen. During the trial, a former military diver would state that he had encountered a situation similar to Richard's in a previous case. A diver signaling out of air when they still have a working supply is a recognized sign of immersion pulmonary edema, a condition where the lungs spontaneously fill with fluid upon immersion in cold water, and if untreated, eventually causes the diver to asphyxiate. Even in 2016, very few people knew anything about it, and to this day, information is just now being implemented into training. Eventually, after 2 days of deliberation, Nigel would be found not guilty, but the damage was done. After 20 years and hundreds of dives, Nigel would lose his sole source of income as he could not cope with working as an instructor any longer. Nigel would state, "I will never teach again. I would like to dive again, probably not in this country." The local dive community not only lost one of their members, but they would also lose one of the most experienced and respected dive instructors. Many believe that Nigel Craig should have never been prosecuted, and that he was not responsible for the death of a student. But the simple truth is that if Richard had never died, it is still possible we may not fully understand IPO. Today, Nigel just wants his story out there. with the hope that more accidents that may involve IPO just may be prevented and lives can be saved. Entering into an unmapped underwater cave is one of the most dangerous tasks a human can ever face. It takes a special diver with technical expertise and experience to map these systems safely. In May of 1988, 3 incredible groups of divers entered the unmapped Little Dismal Sink in Florida with one objective: generate a layout of the cave for other divers. But during their exploration, nothing seemed to go right, from equipment failures to navigation issues and low air supply, which eventually led to a tragedy and an accident that would be studied and learned from for years. This is their story. The Little Dismal Sink, or the Hammock Sink, is located just south of Tallahassee, Florida, an area known throughout the country as one of the best places for one of the most dangerous yet peaceful sports in the world: cave diving. The irony of partnering danger and peace together is not lost on me, but it is entirely true in this sport. While cave diving is widely known as a dangerous sport to those unfamiliar with it, for those that understand the risk and are trained properly, it is usually described as some of the most peaceful moments of their lives. Today, the Little Dismal Sink is part of the Apalachicola National Forest and the second largest sink in the area, losing that top spot to its brother, the Big Dismal Sink. The entire cave system has a depth of just over 200 feet, and the entire length measures just over 900 feet. It is split up into 6 rooms, with each having their own features and landmarks. Each room is separated by different restrictions, with some areas being completely wide open, while others are very narrow. Now remember, in 1988, the deep part of the cave system had not been mapped, so the divers that entered the cave in May had no idea how far these tunnels could go, or the ultimate risk they would be undertaking. If this sounds like it was for advanced and experienced divers, well, you'd be correct, and the men that entered the sink checked that box. Each of them have a deep history with deep sea and cave diving, and the men mentioned in this story would be pioneers in the sport for generations. Some of their techniques and inventions are used to this day, but this is cave diving. Experience always matters, but sometimes things just go wrong. On May 15th, Bill Gavin, Bill McFadden, Bill Main, and others entered Little Dismal Cave with the objective to collect geological samples and survey data for the upstream and downstream tunnels of the deep section. The group had been diving the sink for a few weeks in preparation for this very dive, and they had established a dive line nearly to the deepest area of the cave. A dive line is a thin rope that stretches from the entrance of the sink to each area of the cave. The main purpose is safety, as without a dive line, it can be very easy to become lost. Additionally, if a diver makes a small mistake by displacing dirt on the walls, roof, or floor, a cloud of silt can easily cover them, reducing visibility to nearly zero. In these situations, having an established dive line is crucial to keeping a diver calm and leading them to safety. To reach the deepest section of the cave, the divers would have to navigate through narrow restrictions where they would squeeze their bodies and equipment through sharp boulders, inching their way forward into the next rooms. One mistake or cave-in, well, there was no coming back from that. After navigating through the peanut room or the first room, then the second room, the divers had a choice. They could navigate to the fourth room, through the third room, or through a narrow shortcut that skipped the third room. Finally, they would reach the fifth room, where the upper passage of the cave ends. The upper passage of the cave, at nearly 700 feet long with a depth of 150 feet, was well understood at the time, but in the fifth room, there was a nearly vertical shaft leading to the sixth room at a depth of 170 feet. This would be known as the deep, unmapped section of the cave. Before delving into the incident, it's crucial to understand the function of a dry suit. This waterproof suit provides a pocket of air inside, offering thermal protection from cold water at depth. This is important, as Florida caves are known for being cold, and if you have ever jumped into a cold body of water, well, you would know that your body can literally freeze up while your mind fails to function properly. That is why a dry suit is a crucial piece of equipment to these divers. As the divers descend, the water pressure compresses the dry suit, necessitating the addition of air from cylinders. Controlling buoyancy is essential, as expanding air during ascent could lead to life-threatening situations. Once the divers entered the sink, a few divers almost immediately began collecting samples within the first room, while others, such as Bill Gavin, made a beeline to the deep section of the cave. It was agreed before the dive that Bill Gavin would be exploring the downstream tunnel alone. As the most experienced diver, he didn't want anyone behind him, as the downstream siphon was a narrow tunnel. Bill Main and Bill McFadden would be exploring the upstream tunnel, as they had just a little bit more space, but it still presented many challenges with low ceilings and silty floors, making navigation difficult. Early into the dive after entering the tunnel, McFadden's equipment would become entangled with the guideline, slowing their progress, but they were eventually able to untangle him and continue. They also faced many challenges with visibility, as the tunnel was narrow and caused silt to fill the area around them. At times, they could hardly see a few feet in front of them, which only slowed down their progress. They continuously held on to the guideline that was laid, as it was their only lifeline back to the 6th room. Despite all of the challenges, the two men were able to successfully map a substantial area of the upstream tunnel, but it was on their return that things would begin to go wrong. Bill Main was leading the way, while McFadden followed, but Main would often turn around to ensure that his partner was still behind him. Upon exiting the tunnel and reaching the 6th room, Main would turn towards the entrance and wait for McFadden, who did not emerge as expected. It was merely seconds, but coincidentally, Bill Gavin was exiting the downstream tunnel while Main was waiting for his partner. Gavin had successfully mapped the downstream tunnel, but upon seeing Main, Gavin had a bad feeling as he described, and his instincts would lead him to swiftly enter the upstream tunnel. Gavin would find McFadden nearly 100 feet within the tunnel, off the line, and not moving, as he was almost completely paralyzed by either fear or simply unsure of what to do. But after seeing Gavin, he would light up and begin to follow him out of the tunnel. As they emerged into the 6th room, McFadden would signal that he was out of gas. Keep in mind that McFadden had only been missing for 1 or 2 minutes, so Gavin was surprised to see that he was already out of gas. Low on air, the team was faced with a challenging situation. Gavin only had enough air for a single person to reach the decompression tanks, and with McFadden out of air, he knew that he would have to share, but there simply wasn't enough. With no other options, Gavin would give McFadden his long hose, and he would notice that McFadden was breathing like a horse, indicating that he was scared. At this point, Gavin would state, "McFadden grabbed my manifold like a vise, and I hit the trigger. We go to a vertical pit, and I stopped monitoring and started venting my dry suit. Suddenly, I realized that even though I was venting as fast as I could, we were ascending rapidly. McFadden would not let go of my manifold to vent his suit, and next thing I knew, I was pinned like a bug to the ceiling. I couldn't get him to let go of my manifold, so I could even turn around. I finally had to use the scooter to pull us back down so we could continue out. During the entire exit, Bill Main had hold of McFadden's legs, trying to pull him down by getting as negatively buoyant as he could, but they would soon begin to run out of gas. Gavin would be seconds away from passing out when Bill Main started to buddy breathe with him on his short hose. Bill McFadden was already using Bill Main's long hose, so the trio was down to 1 tank of gas. At this point, Gavin was barely conscious. His head was a ball of screaming agony from carbon dioxide buildup, and Bill Main, in a desperate attempt to save McFadden, was contemplating cutting his suit to release excess air. However, realizing the potential risk and uncertainties, he opted to continue controlling McFadden's buoyancy, but it was already too late. After a minute, Bill Main would watch as his partner's eyes had glossed over, and after becoming unconscious, he would begin floating, succumbing to the effects of a rapid ascent. Bill Main, although fearing for his own life, couldn't help but think McFadden, for the first time in minutes, looked peaceful. He didn't have long to grieve, as after a minute, he would pick up Bill Gavin, who was still buddy breathing with himself, and make the decision to swim further back into the cave. Gavin was screaming that he did not want to go back into the cave, but after securing the second regulator into his mouth, he realized that Main was taking him to clearer water. The last thing Gavin saw was McFadden upside down on the ceiling before he entered a different room. Once in clear water, the duo calmly would stabilize their situation. With Gavin on Main's long hose, they were both able to recollect their thoughts and then locate the dive line. Minutes later, they would reach the decompression tanks and eventually exit the cave. Post-mortem analysis revealed that McFadden suffered an intra-alveolar barotrauma, leading to gas bubbles forming during rapid ascent. ultimately causing his death. Bill Gavin would later state, "I did everything I could for McFadden, and so did Bill Main, and we both nearly got killed. Make absolutely no mistake, trying to rescue a panicked diver is one of the most dangerous things you can attempt." David McDonough and Kevin Gannon stood just above the surface of Lancaster Hole, a deep underwater cave system facing an impossible reality. Their friend, Simon Halliday, had entered the cave solo over 4 hours earlier with the expectation of surfacing after 3 hours. He never showed up. Simon was known to be one of the best cave divers in the area, so his friends were left with a feeling of dread. Something had to be seriously wrong. This is his story. Lancaster Hole is part of one of England's greatest limestone cave networks, extending beneath Cumbria, Lancashire, and the Yorkshire Dales. The cave network was originally founded in 1946, and since then it has welcomed many to explore its depths at all times of the year. Today, if you want to explore or potentially dive sections of the well-liked cave, you simply reserve your spot in advance, and you are all set. The surprisingly unassuming entrance to Lancaster Hole is a manhole cover. Below, the pothole's main shaft opens up, allowing skilled potholers access to the world-famous Easgild Caverns and Three Countries cave system. The entire cave system stretches for over 41 miles, and there are areas throughout the system that can only be accessed by diving as they are fully submerged. Simon Halliday, a 49-year-old father of 2, had explored and dove Lancaster Hole many times. In January 4th, 2020, was supposed to be just another dive. Simon was from the charming town of Clitheroe, where he spent most of his life. He was described as a hard-working and dedicated individual who excelled in everything he set his mind to, especially when it came to physical activity. But there was one sport that always captivated him: cave diving. Simon had a natural talent for the sport, and early on he quickly became one of the most skilled cave divers in the country. His passion for diving led him to explore some of the most challenging and remote cave systems around the world. He had a particular fascination with exploring underwater caves, which required a unique set of skills and equipment, but everyone knew the danger that came with cave diving. After he became a father, Simon decided to take a break from cave diving, as the time commitment of being a family man, along with the dangers of diving, well, it just wasn't worth it anymore. But while on holiday in Egypt, nearly 2 years after he had quit, he got an opportunity to get back into the water. So he did. It was during this trip that he received his dive qualification, which opened up a plethora of opportunities for him. After returning from holiday, Simon would become an active member of the Northern Division of the Cave Diving Group, or CDG, a community of passionate and dedicated cave divers. He was respected and admired by his fellow divers, who regarded him as one of the very best. Simon was best known for his tenacity and unwavering commitment to his goals. He was always considered the strongest member of the team and never shied away from the toughest challenges of a dive. Yet despite all this, he was known to be an extremely humble and approachable man. He was always willing to share his knowledge and expertise with others. To improve his stamina and fitness, Simon would join the running club Clayton Lee Moore's Harriers in January 2004. He always referred to himself as the Fat Caver because he liked to have a good time out on the town Friday night, so this was a way to keep his body in check. Unsurprisingly, he would go on to compete in some of the toughest fell races as a renowned fell runner, and his plan? Well, it worked. His cave diving ability would only improve. On January 4th, 2020, Simon visited Lancaster Hole with his 2 friends, David McDonough and Kevin Gannon. But Simon, being an experienced diver who had explored this system before, planned to dive alone, while his friends explored a different section of the cave. The total dive time was expected to be 3 hours. On this particular day, there was an unusually high amount of water flowing into the channel, which made the dive more challenging than usual. Despite the adverse conditions, Simon was determined to proceed with the dive, as he wanted to complete the challenge that he had set for himself. Simon would be wearing a rebreather, which was allegedly still in development at the time and not yet ready for purchase. The device was provided to him by Sump UK, a sporting goods company specifically for this dive. A rebreather is an underwater breathing device that captures carbon dioxide from a diver's exhaled breath, allowing it to recycle the significantly lost oxygen content. Just before entering Lancaster Hole, Simon would post on social media, "Just setting off now. I'll be underground all day. We'll post something later." This would be the final post he ever made. As Simon descended into the depths of the cave, he encountered a series of challenges that he had not anticipated. The water flow was stronger than he had expected, and he had to exert more effort to make any progress. Despite this, Simon remained calm and focused, relying on his years of experience and training to navigate through the cave. After Simon left, his friends would wait hours, and after the 3-hour mark, there was still no sign of him. Both of them were confident that Simon knew what he was doing, and if he ran into any trouble, well, he could handle himself, so they decided to wait. But then 4 hours hit, a mark that meant something had to be wrong. Simon would not be this late. With their anxiety continuing to increase, they eventually decided to call the police, and rescue groups were immediately dispatched to the site. The rescue operation would contain over 40 members who were all experienced divers and had undergone rigorous training for such situations. They began their search at the spot where the cave divers entered the downstream route of Lancaster Hole. In case Simon had exited one of the systems somewhere else, the team members and cave diver also examined other entrances and potential exits, but they found nothing. Soon after the rescue divers entered the water, the search would end. Sadly, Simon was found about 196 feet down the sump. They found him after 14 minutes of diving. The rescue divers would bring him back to the sump pole chamber and remove him from the water, but their fears were confirmed. Simon was gone. Simon's oxygen supply hose appeared to have been severed or ripped out. However, it was unclear if this occurred during the dive or after the recovery. The subsequent lengthy and challenging extraction back to the fell's surface involved all team members, but Simon was eventually lifted from the cave where he could rejoin his family. Uncertainty surrounds the tragedy's actual details. As mentioned previously, there was a greater than usual flow of water into the tunnel. Although Simon did not consider this to be a problem, it seemed that during his time in the hole, the water's current intensity grew. This could have made him use more air on his return trip, where he would have been fighting the current. If Simon had been under stress and had to breathe more heavily because his air was running out, this issue might have gotten worse. Of course, this is all speculation, but Simon's dive computers and Quest data also supported the idea that he had shifted to his bailout option once his rebreathing apparatus failed. The equipment used a straight fitting into the rebreather, according to the rescue diver. If such were the case, the fitting would not have unscrewed according to him, because it was an elbow fitting with a 90-degree bend. As a result, Simon was in a race against time when his rebreather failed, and he nearly made it out. The accident would be classified as a drowning as the official cause of death. Obviously, the incident broke the hearts of his family and the diving community as a whole. The Pegasus Diving Club would post a memorial to Simon, and the amount of comments and stories is a testament to the life he lived. John Cordingley, his close friend's post, sums up everything you need to know about Simon. A character like Simon would have struggled to come to terms with the insidious onset of old age, alongside the detrimental effects of one's capabilities. Yet he achieved a lot more in his shortened life than most others do in their 60 years, and then 10 or beyond. He was a genuine and generous bloke, always willing to give his time to help. Simon was one of the northern section's most promising newer members, and his loss was a bitter pill to swallow for all of us. Goodbye, old pal. In 1978, 3 Americans submerged into an off-limits cave off the coast of Athens, Greece. This cave network was notorious for being an underwater maze with intense currents. The dive was supposed to be only a few hours, but the 3 men just disappeared. For 30 years, nobody knew what happened to them. But during a search for another lost diver, the secrets of their 1978 expedition would begin to come to light. This is their story. Greece, a country known for its mysteries, is home to over 10,000 caves. One of these is the Vouliagmeni Lake, a dangerous and extensive network of underwater caves. The lake's unpredictable currents make it a challenging place to explore, even for experienced divers. The lake is located 15 miles south of Athens and was formed about 2,000 years ago due to an earthquake that caused a large cavern to collapse. The collapsed cavern's outline can still be seen from a distance. The lake has unique environmental conditions. It is supplied with warm seawater, around 28 to 35 degrees Celsius, through an underwater channel that spreads through a network of flooded caves. As a result, the lake's temperature never drops below 18 degrees Celsius. The underwater cave continues deep inside the mountain and has never been fully explored. It's so vast that it's impossible to trace its end, even with sonar detection. The submerged cavern is located near the lake's edge and has 14 tunnels. One of these tunnels is 800 meters long and 60 to 150 meters wide, making it one of the world's longest. Many underwater expeditions have been carried out to map the cave, and a few amateur divers have drowned trying. The first to venture into its depths were the Germans back in the 1940s. Their initial findings sparked the curiosity of many divers from around the world. Years later, a tragic incident occurred. Two divers, while exploring the cave, lost their lives just a few meters from the surface. Their bodies were never recovered. This unfortunate event caught the attention of Jean-Jacques Bollens, a famous Swiss diver and president of the International Association of Cave Divers. In 1988, Bollens went on a mission to explore the cave. This project was supported by the Ministry of Culture and financed by the municipality of Vouliagmeni. On his first dive, Bollens made a remarkable discovery. He found a narrow passage at a depth of 30 meters, leading to a massive underwater room. Bollens believed that the two divers lost their lives due to the strong currents inside the cave and their lack of knowledge about the cave's geography and morphology. Sadly, they were not the only ones. 6 more explorers met the same fate, mainly due to inadequate equipment and unfamiliarity with the cave's underwater environment. In 1995, a ministry decision led to the closure of the cave to the public after countless deaths had occurred within its depths. Since then, only scientific diving has been allowed. Nowadays, the cave with its warm water and high hydrogen sulfide content serves as a spa. Greek doctors even recommend spending time there for various ailments. Donald Mitchard, a 32-year-old Air Force sergeant born on August 8, 1946, was stationed at Hellinikon, the U.S. Air Force support base at the Athens airport in Greece. He joined the Air Force right after graduating from Bideford High School 12 years prior. Meanwhile, the Granroth siblings, Jan and Mark, hailed from Sacramento. Jan, an outgoing and athletic 20-year-old, had graduated from Encina High School and chose the military to guide her life. Her leadership skills were evident when she served as her platoon leader during basic training. Mark, age 21, was part of the family's paint contracting business and was a keen athlete who enjoyed cycling in Hawaii and backpacking. Both Donald and Jan were stationed at the Hellinikon base near Athens. Mark planned a summer trip to Europe to connect with Jan before backpacking and diving across the country. Both of them, being skilled divers, were excited at the many opportunities they would have over the next few months. On September 9, 1978, Mark and Jan, accompanied by the more experienced diver Donald, arrived at Lake Foglamili. They intended to complete a recreation dive of the intense cave network below the waters. Cave diving in 1978 was still in its infancy and was even more dangerous without proper training. Yet these were supposed to be skilled divers who knew what they were doing, but the trio would fail to fully prepare for the dive. They would make 3 crucial errors. Number 1, they didn't bring extra lights. For obvious reasons, this left the window open for something to go wrong. Number 2, they didn't bring spare tanks. Again, this one is pretty self-explanatory. If you don't have air to breathe, well, you just won't last long. And finally, number 3, they failed to establish a guideline. Mistakes 1 and 2 are egregious today, but the third mistake set all 3 divers up for failure. What made this cave so dangerous was the intense network of tunnels, length, and depth as mentioned earlier. Their dive was set up for failure from the beginning, and while exploring the undersea caves, the trio would vanish. Their disappearance led to an accident analysis that shaped the current rules and training for cave divers today. Antoine Oncolek, a seasoned Swiss caver, found himself trapped in the labyrinth. He was on an expedition tracing the path of the American divers who had disappeared years ago. Suddenly, he was hit by nitrogen narcosis. He felt as if he was bound by unseen ropes trapped in a crystal clear space. He realized why the American divers never made it out. The deep narcosis in the vast tunnels disoriented him, making him lose his sense of depth and distance. He felt dizzy, but thanks to his experience in the sight of another diver, he managed to escape the underground cave. The Greek authorities tried to find another entrance to the cave by using dyes in the water, but their efforts were in vain. A week later, they had to call off the search when a diver nearly drowned after the current ripped off his face mask. With the official search abandoned, Fran Granroth, the mother of the missing divers Mark and Jan, took it upon herself to find her sons. She wrote letters to every president who moved into the White House, starting with Jimmy Carter. She couldn't believe her sons were cave diving without light, as they were experienced divers who just didn't make these mistakes. She feared that political unrest would have put her sons in danger. 2 weeks after the divers' disappearance, the Greek authorities issued a presumptuous finding of death. Arnold Granroth, a cousin of Jan and Mark, revealed that their father, Russell, had made 2 trips to Greece to find out what happened to his sons. Sadly, Russell passed away in 1992, never knowing the fate of Mark and Jan. Almost 3 decades later, a group of divers would enter the cave, looking for the remains of a Greek photographer who had entered the caves in 1990 to find the missing Americans. That group of divers would come across 2 unidentified bodies. After extraction, they would eventually be released by Greek authorities on February 14, 2007, and sent to the US military officials for DNA testing. It was not until June 19 that Fran Granroth received a call confirming that the remains were those of her children. A mother's heart ached as she received her children's remains. Each Christmas, she had hoped that they were still alive, but now she knew that they were gone. She didn't believe the funeral would bring closure. Death, especially of the young, leaves a void that lasts forever. Their brother Jim, a painter in Sacramento, also mourned their loss. He was just 16 when his siblings vanished. The funerals for Mark and Jan were set for August 4, 2007, in Sebeka, Minnesota. Donald was buried in Biddeford, Maine, leaving behind his wife, Rosemary, and their 3 children. Donald, Jan, and Mark's dive is historic for all the wrong reasons, but so much has been learned from their story. Rules have been enforced to this day to ensure that what happened in that cave never happens again. Or at least, we can try. On July 19, 2014, Corporal Fernando Aguirre was 45 meters underwater and faced with a decision. He had been called to rescue 2 divers from a cave in Spain, but that was hours ago, and he wasn't even confident that they were still alive. But he did know 2 more individuals on the surface were friends of the divers, and they were anxiously waiting for him to return. And not to mention the nearly half-dozen specialists that were helping with his rescue mission, or his dive partner that swam beside him. In front of Aguirre was nothing. Well, there was something there, but the issue is Aguirre didn't know what. You see, he literally couldn't see what was in front of him and his dive partner, because the underwater cave had been silted out from the pair of divers that went missing. This means that if they entered into the silted part of the cave, they would not be able to see where they were going. So Aguirre was faced with a decision: to turn around empty-handed or enter into the silt with no way to guide him or his partner. They may find the missing divers, or they may go missing themselves. But Aguirre took a deep breath and reminded himself why he was there. With that small moment, he looked at his partner, then began swimming into uncertainty. This is his story. Before we jump into today's story, I want to apologize in advance for any mispronunciations that I may make. It is not on purpose or intentional, and as always, I appreciate every one of you for watching. Cova de las Arquettes is a limestone cave that stretches about 80 meters in Costa Brava, Spain, and is known to attract adventurers and underwater photographers alike. For years, Cova de las Arquettes remained a hidden treasure to the locals, known only to those who dared to explore its underwater depths. Getting to the cave is an adventure in itself. Once you arrive at Ponte de las Arquettes, you must start the dive and continue for another 50 to 60 meters, following the bottom marine until you find the entrance mouth. The entrance descends approximately 10 meters or 33 feet beneath the surface of the sea. The gap is a mere 2.5 meters wide, and it leads to a winding passage filled with stones, ascending about 4 meters. As you explore further, the cave plunges to depths of around 40 meters, but what truly sets Cova de l'Arquets apart is the unknown. At the end of the cave lies a small opening, shrouded in darkness and mystery. This obscure passage leads to a muddy cavity that, interestingly, had never had any record of anyone successfully passing through the opening due to its obscurity and the potential absence of visibility depending on sea conditions. On the morning of July 19th, Ricard Dinicio and 2 friends set sailed from the port of Les Soustrettes, heading towards a local cliff named Captain Labari. The 4 men had met through a cave diving group and had planned to put their skills to the test that day. The issue was that none of them had ever explored extremely complex or dangerous caves, much less a cave system that had not been fully explored. This trip had taken months to plan, and the 4 men were going to take advantage of their opportunity. The intent that morning was to dive several caves, as there are plenty in the area, and most of them are harmless. Although they had dived in the Costa Brava area before, what attracted them to this cave was the opportunity for new discoveries. Scientists were interested in exploring it, and they would collaborate with divers to ensure a safe entry and exit strategy. The friends were aware of the risk involved in diving at Cova de l'Arquets, but that very danger was what made it so captivating and addictive for them. It was like how thrill seekers enjoy activities like skydiving or wingsuit flying. As they approached the area, Ricard Dinicio and one of their friends got ready, exchanged nervous looks, and entered the clear blue water. Meanwhile, their 4th friend stayed on the boat, ready to help if anything went wrong. He would be there to assist them, alert nearby divers, and contact authorities in case of any emergencies. Early on, Ricard Dinicio and the other diver explored some nearby caves in the area before coming across Cova de l'Arquets, or the Cave of the Lobsters' submerged entrance. It appeared suddenly before them, providing an intriguing path into darkness, and even at a depth of 23 feet, the sunlight illuminated the water, making them feel safe around the entrance. Inside, the cave seemed dark and mysterious, with soft clay walls and silt-covered floors, which posed a risk of blinding them if disturbed. Normally, divers would use a guideline outside the cave for navigation, especially in such conditions. However, earlier in the dive, Ricard had reached to his diving belt, where his spool of guideline rope normally hung, and there was nothing there. After all the planning, prep, and dive time, they had forgotten the rope that was their lifeline. It was at this point the men would make a decision. They had waited too long for this moment, and they couldn't stop their dive now. They would just have to proceed without it. So the 3 men would begin the swim into Cova de l'Arquets. With their flashlights, the 3 men traveled 45 meters, or 148 feet underground and underwater. The beginning stretch of the cave is ideal for recruiting lobsters, hence its second name. But when the rock ends, the texture and terrain vastly changes. The rock gives way, from which point clay and narrow unexplored territory begin. It was here, 45 meters into the cave, that Ricard and Dinicio's friend began to feel overwhelmed. He began to panic, completely unsure if he wanted to even be there. Through a series of gestures, he communicated his decision to return to the surface. Although Ricard and Dinicio respected his decision, they were determined to continue. They reassured their friend that they would be fine, relying on their experience and instincts. They believed in their abilities and considered trusting their instincts a strength rather than a weakness. Ricard and Dinicio shared a determined look, signaling their commitment to continue their adventure into the cave. With their flashlights guiding them and the visible entrance reassuring them, they swam deeper. Inside, everything seemed perfect. The silt remained undisturbed, the walls caused no trouble, and sunlight still peeked through. Yet as they delved further, the darkness grew eerie and uncertainty began to creep in. After traveling over 80 meters or 262 feet into the cave, they both realized it was time to turn back. They knew any mishap, even a small disturbance of silt, could jeopardize their escape. However, as they attempted to return, they discovered their fins had stirred up the silt, plunging them into near blindness. Without markers or a rope to guide them, they became disoriented, unsure of which direction was up or down. They reached for each other in the darkness, but found nothing. Unbeknownst to them, their progress had inadvertently created a dense cloud of mud-filled water, effectively erecting a disorienting black wall behind them. The path they had entered through was now obscured, shrouded in impenetrable darkness, devoid of any visual markers or lines that could guide them. Ricard and Dionisio found themselves in a desperate predicament with no clear path to escape. The weight of their situation intensified by the second, as their air supply was limited and would soon be reaching critical levels within their tanks. The search for an exit became an agonizing race against time. Dionisio had a sudden realization. Waiting for the silt to settle was not an option. With their air running low, they couldn't afford to wait and hope for clarity. They needed a solution, and they needed it fast. Just when Ricard and Dionisio felt trapped in the darkness, a slender beam of sunlight pierced through, offering them a glimmer of hope. Driven by desperation, they made a risky gamble swimming towards it, finding a crack larger than expected. The passage was narrow, and it pressed against their chests and backs as they pushed through it. With each inch, there was an uncertainty whether this passage would lead to safety, or was it just another dead end that would trap them both. The passage went diagonally upwards towards the surface and was 80 meters from the original cave entrance. After a few minutes of fighting through the restriction, Ricard and Dionisio would make it through the narrow passage and find a subterranean lake, a bubble of breathable air, a pocket of oxygen that seemed to have been waiting for them for centuries. But this didn't exactly mean that they were safe. Inside the pocket, they hesitated, fearing it would be filled with deadly carbon dioxide, but having no choice, the duo would remove their masks. Luckily, the air was breathable, providing a moment of relief and a surge of adrenaline. Feeling as though they had narrowly escaped death, they snapped photos to remember their stroke of luck. But reality would soon set back in. What now? Meanwhile, their friends had been waiting for the duo to emerge from the water for hours, and sensing trouble, they contacted emergency services at 11 a.m., prompting a swift response from Spain's Civil Guard. Team leader Corporal Fernando Aguirre coordinated a rescue effort, mobilizing divers and enlisting support from various sources to gather information about the cave. Biologists and scientists didn't provide much new information to Corporal Aguirre, which was disappointing because he didn't know much to begin with. One biologist gave a vague map that showed where Ricard and Dionisio disappeared. Aguirre and his team believed the missing divers were likely inside the salty cave, but they also knew the divers would have surely run out of air at this point. Honestly, Corporal Aguirre had little hope that they were even still alive, but just maybe, they had found a way. Meanwhile, Ricard and Dionisio were stuck in an air pocket, unsure when help would come. The bubble, measuring approximately 30 square meters with a height of 1.5 meters, seemed like a sanctuary as it held an estimated 35,000 liters of air. But this was still only a limited amount of air, and once it ran out, they would slowly suffocate. But there was another problem. As Ricard and Dionisio breathed the air, it was slowly turning into carbon dioxide, making it harder for them to breathe and poisoning their bodies. The more they breathed, the more they hurt themselves. But if they didn't breathe, they couldn't survive. It was a paradox. They struggled to stay afloat because the cave's walls were slippery and there was nowhere to rest. The effort made them breathe faster, worsening the effects of carbon dioxide poisoning. And as time passed, they became dehydrated, cold, and hopeless. Ricard was in worse condition than Dionisio, but they both knew their situation was bad, and they accepted that they might not make it out alive. They didn't want to talk or even look at each other. All they desired was quietness in the dark cave. Over time, Ricard struggled to keep himself afloat, often slipping beneath the water's surface unnoticed. Dionisio, drained and worn out, summoned all of his strength each time to rescue his friend. It was during one of these episodes that Dionisio would glance at his friend, only to witness the sight of his body, almost lifeless, continuously slipping below the water. A surge of adrenaline coursed through Dionisio's veins as he summoned every ounce of strength he had left. He managed to grab a hold of Ricard and pulled his head above the water's surface, fighting against the inevitable doom that leaned over them. 5 more hours would pass. There was no more air in Ricard or Dionisio's tanks. Their bodies were shaking from the cold, and they could barely keep their heads above the water. They were exhausted. Their minds and bodies were beginning to fail them. Ricard's weakened body would once again slip into the water as he had no control, but this time, Dionisio could only watch the lifeless body of his friend submerge into the water. He could do nothing but lay on the slippery rock, half submerged in the water himself. His body was devoid of any strength, and he knew that it was only a matter of time before he too would join his friend. Unbeknownst to Denisio, Corporal Aguirre and his team of skilled divers had been searching for them since 5 p.m. They had encountered a thick layer of silt stirred up by Ricard and Denisio earlier, which had delayed the two divers as they were forced to decide if it was worth putting their own lives in danger. For all they knew, Ricard and Denisio were not even alive, and they could just wait for the silt to settle, and Corporal Aguirre had not given up hope yet. As the night descended, the divers retreated, finding nothing within the silt-covered cave, and leaving Denisio to grapple with fear and exhaustion. However, the search resumed the next morning, drawing attention from numerous journalists. Despite the influx of experienced rescuers from across the country, the chances of finding Ricard and Denisio seemed bleak. But finally, one thing was going their way. The silt had settled by the morning, allowing clearer visibility for the divers. Before entering the cave, they secured a dive line outside to prevent getting lost like Ricard and Denisio. The divers would reach the 80-meter mark, where they would come across a beam of light that was impossible to see the day before because of the amount of silt in the cave. As they looked towards the light, they noticed a small crack within the rock that was just wide enough for a diver to squeeze through. They had exhausted all other options, so they thought just maybe this was where Ricard and Denisio had gone. Inside, they followed the faint glimmer of light, imagining it was the route the missing men took. The first rescuer encountered tight passages but pressed on and eventually reached the large subterranean lake. The diver would begin to sweep the area with his flashlight and would see the body of a diver. His heart sank as he noticed it was Ricard, and he thought in that moment that all was lost. While still looking for another body, he would see the legs of another diver halfway into the water, and after emerging from the cave, he was surprised to hear a faint sound, the sound of someone breathing. Denisio was clinging desperately to a rock with the little strength that he had left. When Denisio realized he wasn't alone anymore, he let out a pained cry, startling Corporal Aguirre and the other diver. Although Denisio had somehow managed to cling to life in the treacherous conditions, he was severely weakened by exhaustion, dehydration, hypothermia, and disorientation, making his survival uncertain. While it was a relief he was still alive, extracting him from the cave presented another daunting challenge. Despite the proximity of rescue, Denisio resisted wearing the air tank they offered, delirious and unable to comprehend the situation, mistaking the rescuers as threats. Understanding Denisio's confusion, Corporal Aguirre realized he needed someone familiar to cooperate. Urgently returning to the surface, he persuaded Denisio's diving companion to join the rescue mission. Despite the uncertainty, he agreed, recognizing it as the only hope for Denisio's survival. Re-entering the cave with additional rescuers, they navigated to the air pocket where Denisio awaited. Seeing a familiar face brought some comfort, but as time dwindled, Corporal Aguirre decided to sedate Denisio to ensure a safe extraction. Less than a day after entering the cave, Denisio emerged with Corporal Aguirre, the rescue team, and his friend. With Denisio safe, attention turned to recovering Ricard's body. Denisio's survival marked a remarkable feat, making him the first diver in Spain to endure such an ordeal. Following the media frenzy, Corporal Aguirre initiated a thorough investigation into the tragic dive. The importance of training in high-risk situations like underwater cave diving cannot be overstated. First and foremost, training provides divers with a thorough understanding of the risks associated with cave diving, including hazards such as low visibility, entanglement, equipment failure, and psychological challenges like nitrogen narcosis and hypoxia. By recognizing these dangers, divers can make informed decisions and take appropriate precautions to mitigate risks. Moreover, training ensures that divers are proficient in the use of specialized equipment, such as rebreathers, dive lights, and guideline reels, which are essential for navigating the unique conditions found in underwater caves. The discovery of Ricard's death was eventually ruled as carbon dioxide poisoning. Critical safety measures, such as deploying a dive line, were overlooked, contributing to the dire outcome. Some faulted Denisio for Ricard's demise, but Corporal Aguirre's report acknowledged that he already saved his friend multiple times, but that in the end, he just didn't have enough strength to prevent him from drowning. But despite all of this, what matters most is that one diver lost his life, and another was changed forever. Thankfully, Denisio would make a remarkable full recovery.